Hello everyone. This is our first presentation for our online format. So today we're going to be discussing Northern Renaissance art. I have a list of artists on this page. The main ones we'll be discussing today are Jan van Eyck, Peter Bruegel the Elder, and Hieronymus Bosch. The Lombard brothers and Albert Dürer are also part of the Northern Renaissance artistic tradition. They have significant influence, and if you have interest in the Northern Renaissance artwork, I suggest you look them up. So now the Renaissance in Northern Europe. When we're talking about Northern Europe, we're discussing the geographical locations of what is modern-day Netherlands, Germany, France, and Belgium. The time period we're discussing is around the 16th and 17th centuries. So you have the 16th century, a significant religious and political event is when the Protestants split away from the Catholic Church. This is called the Reformation. At this time, the Catholic Church was seen as decadent and corrupt. So the subjects of the art of the Northern Renaissance differ from the subject of the Southern Italian Renaissance artists that mainly depicted biblical narratives. So in Renaissance in Northern Europe, the main artistic styles that we see surround two different tenets. The first is the attention or the careful attention to texture and fine detail, and the depiction of everyday objects as well as everyday people with religious symbolism. This careful attention to detail can be linked to two things. One is the use and popularization of the oil on canvas or oil on panel medium. Oil painting allowed for smoother transitions, as we saw in our discussion of the painting media. Oil takes longer to dry, therefore you can work a little bit slower, you can blend a little bit more easily. In addition to that, many of Northern European artists began in the manuscript tradition. Manuscript illumination was part of a long tradition of decorative arts in Northern Europe. Sometimes artists would use a single-haired paintbrush to paint these very fine details. So when the artwork becomes a larger format as opposed to a manuscript page, that same amount of fine detail is placed in a larger format, which ends up making it more monumental. So the Protestant Reformation, you have Italy as being the dominant power in the Italian Renaissance. Eventually that will shift over to France, ruled by emperors named the Holy Roman Emperors by the Pope. And eventually Spain becomes the dominant power after that. So we'll see during the Rococo period, the 17th and 18th centuries, France comes up in popularity. But at this time, Italy is the kind of main cultural artistic center as well as the political leader of most of Europe. So for the Reformation, the main figure that many of you may have heard of is Martin Luther. In 1517, Martin Luther issues his 95 Theses, so he objects to these church practices. One of these would be the selling of indulgences. If you were to commit a sin, depending on the severity of the sin, you could come to the clergy and you could pay money to purchase an indulgence or basically purchase forgiveness for your sin. People like Martin Luther thought that this was a corrupt practice, especially since most of the money collected for these indulgences went into the personal pockets of the church clergy. They would buy expensive commissions, objects, had luxurious lifestyles, and Martin Luther believed that this was obsolete, that an attainment of forgiveness or a higher state of being was between the individual and the divine. So we see this difference in religious practices becoming visible as to what type of subject matter is represented in the artwork of the Catholic Italian Renaissance or the Protestant Northern Renaissance. So Catholics embrace church decoration. As we saw in the Italian Renaissance, you have that mass commissioning of altarpieces, all with this biblical imagery, biblical narratives being referenced constantly. Protestants believed this kind of imagery, at least within the churches, could lead to idolatry or the false worship of idols, and that it distracted viewers from communicating directly with God. So Protestant churches we see are pretty plain on the interiors and exteriors, so this is not the same kind of extravagant decoration you have with, say, the Romanesque and Gothic churches of medieval Europe. So art, however, in the Protestant tradition was a teaching tool, particularly prints. So a large characteristic of Netherlandish painters was that they were interested in scenes from daily life. In Peter Bruegel the Elder's Netherlandish proverbs, we see rhythms, activities, and emotions of ordinary people, as opposed to the higher people in society, like a church member or a prominent family in society. Peter Bruegel the Elder is a very famous artist from the Netherlands. He is famous for his landscapes and humorous scenes of peasant life. Bruegel was also interested in social types. So this means when you see a recognizable figure, identifiable as farmers or townspeople. So typically, social types will have certain associations, whether that's how somebody behaves or how they appear physically. So these provide general and universal subjects rather than idealized individuals. So it allows the average person to be able to connect more with the art or the subject of the artwork rather than it being specific just to one ruler or one high court member. In Peter Bruegel's Netherlandish proverbs, proverbs are short statements of wisdom or advice that have passed into general use. They often refer to a common experience expressed in a metaphor. For example, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. In Bruegel's painting, there's over 100 proverbs being illustrated. Most of them are quite humorous. They have this kind of comedic spin on them. Some are now culturally obscure, while some are actually still in use. Many of you may have even heard them as a child or still continue to hear them to this day. For example, these three details from the painting here, starting with the left, you have an illustration of the world turned upside down. So we can see the globe there that has been turned upside down. In the middle, you have a gentleman who is, quote, beating his head against a wall. So in the sense that you are causing excess stress on yourself. And lastly, no use crying over spilt milk. So essentially the idea that what happens, happens. You can't cry over something you can't control. So these are kind of everyday metaphors for the common people. Jan van Eyck is one of the most significant painters in all of the Northern European tradition. Again, he was very well known for popularizing the use of oil, as well as popularizing his specific painting techniques, which will also be a great influence to later Renaissance art after you see the exchange of Northern and Italian Renaissance art. Like many other Northern Renaissance artists, he worked as a miniature painter for the Duke of Burgundy. We will be viewing his Arnolfini portrait, but he has many other works. The Ghent altarpiece is another one. The Ghent altarpiece is one of the most spectacular altarpieces in existence. It was highly prized by Hitler as well. It was actually stolen by him during the Second World War. If any of you have ever seen Monuments Men, that movie is actually based off of an actual group called the Monuments Men who were tasked with recovering all of the stolen artworks from Hitler after the end of World War II. So here we have what is titled the Arnolfini portrait. For many years, scholars presented this as a wedding portrait, but there's actually a lot of debate on what the painting really represents. The most accepted interpretation is that this is not an image that is taking place in the middle of a ceremony, but is simply a double portrait of a couple who are already married. It's unsure which specific Arnolfini this is a portrait of, but we know that this was an Italian merchant family who worked in Bruges in Belgium. This image is very much a display of wealth, from the clothing to the furnishing of the house. Again, Van Eyck uses oil paint instead of tempera, and more significantly, Northern Renaissance artists use layers of oil paint to create a sort of luminescent quality. It really shows the love for textures in the Northern Renaissance, from the fur of the dog and Arnolfini's coat to the plush, soft, kind of velvety feel of the green dress. This painting as well is absolutely loaded with symbolism. If we start in the top right image, we can see that the shoes of Arnolfini have been taken off. So this is often a reference to a sacred event taking place or signifying that the individual is standing on holy ground. The next picture of the chandelier, if you take a look at it, you can see that it's a little bit odd as there's only one candle in the entire chandelier. This is symbolic of the singular presence of God. The image below of the mirror is one of the most famous aspects of the painting. We can see that the mirror is behind the couple, so if you look to the full portrait, you can see just above their hands is the mirror, which we have a detail of here. So what's interesting here is that you see the backs of Arnolfini, of his wife, but you also see two people standing in this doorway, and you actually see the rest of the room here. So the idea is that we are the people in the mirror, that we are witnessing this event. It's an idea of witnessing that is also reverberated in the artist's signature above the mirror. If you take a look at the top left image, you can see the script that's located right above the top of the mirror. It essentially says, Johann Van Eyck was here, and reveals the artist's presence as well as alluding to the viewer's presence in this scene. Along the frame of the mirror, we can see scenes from the Passion of Christ. So you have this subject matter of a wedding, but you also have these subtle religious undertones of the candle, the removal of the shoes, and the scene from the Passion of Christ. More symbolism is seen in the belongings of Arnolfini. Oranges are a testament to the wealth of the patron, as they were very expensive in Flanders. They would have had to have been imported, most likely from Spain. And I want to take a minute as well to talk about the dog. The dog is actually a symbol of fidelity, so loyalty to one's spouse. there was a question of, or let me say that there was a theory a couple years ago from one scholar that discussed the presence of this dog as well as connecting or referencing the possibility that the female in this portrait might be pregnant. So this scholar's theory was that the dog's presence, along with the female being pregnant and seemingly trying to hide her belly, is signaling that she was not loyal to her soon-to-be husband. However, this, or at least more recent theories, have debunked this theory of infidelity, where modern scholars have noted the fashion of the time. So in Flanders, in this era, it was actually very popular to have massive folds of fabric. This hinted that you were exceedingly wealthy, that you could afford to have this excess of material. Our next artist is Hieronymus Bosch. There's very little known of Bosch's life or training, in the sense that he left behind no letters or diaries, or at least none have been found in existence. So nothing is really known of his personality or his thoughts on the meaning of his art. But based on the images that he produces, we can surmise maybe what he might be commenting on. He was born south of present-day Netherlands. Both his father and brothers were painters. Bosch produced several triptychs. A triptych is just a 3-paneled artwork, typically used as an altarpiece. Among his most famous altarpieces is the Garden of Earthly Delights. So here are the 3 panels. Beginning on the left, you have the realm of heaven. The center is the realm of earth. And the right panel depicts hell. Now this panel opens as well as closes. So when it's open, this is the imagery you see. On the next slide, we'll be seeing what it looks like when it's closed. So there's a different interaction of the viewer and the image depending on whether the triptych is actually opened or closed. This triptych was first viewed in the palace of the Counts of Nassau in Brussels, which tells us that this was a commissioned piece rather than just being created for Bosch's own pleasure. Scholars have debated about the true meaning of this work as well, as you will see in a moment the kind of odd creatures and odd compositions that it has in this painting. One theory is that it is basically a visual protest against physical and materialistic indulgence. When closed, the image forms a perfect sphere. It's a planet-like clear container that is half filled with water. Some people interpret this as the moment of the flood when God cleansed the earth that was consumed with vice, and others interpret this as being day 3 of God's creation of the world, often citing Psalm 33, "For he spoke, and it came to be, he commanded, and it stood firm." Taking a look at the image, we can see that in the top left, God is represented as a man holding a book, and the inscription is actually, or the inscription, part of it on the left, part of it on the right, is actually Psalm 33. So let's take a look a little bit more closely at the interior panels. In the left panel, we have the introduction of Eve to Adam. Now, this is not a typical representation. Typically, you would have representations of Adam and Eve, but they would be represented either at the moment of temptation or after or during the expulsion from the garden. As well, I want you to kind of take a look around and examine the kind of animals and creatures that are here. we can see that there are some creatures that are familiar and some that are these kind of odd composite creatures. You have birds, but then you also have these kind of odd platypus fish figures. If you take a look in the full panel image to the right, in the center to the left, you can see that there's actually a white unicorn drinking from one of the lakes. So there's a sense that the Garden of Heaven encompasses not just creatures in existence on Earth, but creatures that were fabled to have existed and some that are just these kind of creations by Bosch. So now we see all of these creatures of God's creation where he seemingly hoped to leave a signature on the world. But we'll see that in the central panel, scholars often attribute this as being commentary on God's inclusion of free will. That Bosch is stating visually this may have been the largest divine mistake, as sometimes free will does not necessarily imply having morals or obedience. So this is the panel that bestowed the name the Garden of Earthly Delights. Here we see the offspring of Adam and Eve. So this is meant to replicate the earthly realm. Bosch is very well known as being the Renaissance surrealist. There's a very surreal sense to the imagery as well as the composite creatures here, mainly in the fact that ordinary objects are juxtaposed in an unordinary fashion. So let's take some details and see what this looks like. So we can see that you have figures of humans, both male and female, but you also have these kind of odd creatures. We can see that one individual has a blueberry for a head. You see this creature that has, or these two people that are, their torsos, their heads are kind of enveloped by this tulip, and an owl sits on top of it. You also have different races being depicted, which is also unusual for this age. And what we see here in particularly is there is a lot of nudity. There is also a hint at unsavory sexual activity, but no actual depictions of copulation. So again, it could be commentary on the indulgence of earthly and physical pleasures, but a more recent theory has also been suggested that it could be relating to, or could be relating humans to animals, plants, and nature, that we all serve our part in this world. We are born, we live, we procreate, and we die. So the hell panel, this scene is very dark and ominous, contrasting the bright, colorful, and playful nature of the earthly panel. And here we see humans are subject to strange tortures from these odd demonic creatures. So you can see, just like in the earth panel, you have all these strange people. In the details here, we see these weird, very surreal kind of scenes. This large bird figure is wearing a pot on his head, but notice that it is a black pot. So think back to the proverb of the kettle calling the pot black. He's eating an individual here and also defecating human beings at the same time. If we look at the woman who is at the foot of this bird-headed creature, we can see that she's being held by this sort of demon. She has a frog on her chest, which was a bad omen, and you can see her reflection in the behind of this other creature. Now her eyes are closed, and this is hinting that she possibly indulged in vanity or focusing too much on her appearance. I've included this URL for you guys. It's a wonderful website. It's basically an interactive where if you're interested in seeing more of Bosch's kind of surreal and odd creatures, you can go to this website. It will either give you a tour, or you can tour or kind of peruse through the website on your own. I do suggest you guys read some of this. It has information all throughout each 3 panels, as well as the exterior, with just some wonderful information that we don't have enough time to cover. So now we'll move to the late Renaissance. So when we talked about the high Italian Renaissance as well as the early Renaissance, we talked about certain trends and motifs that evolved but also became standardized. So art after the high Renaissance, scholars generally date the end of the high Renaissance with the death of Raphael in 1520. So art during this time grows out of the possibilities suggested by the work of the high Renaissance, particularly of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. The new generation of artists in the late Renaissance were trying to come into their own while still being under the shadow of these highly productive and famous artists of the high Renaissance. Mainly at this time, the 2 still living were Michelangelo and Titian. So some similarities as far as subject matter are that artists will continue to focus on religious imagery, but what we see is that the forms become even more exaggerated, dissonant, and distorted. There is a direct contrast with the insistence on harmony and precision that was valued by the high Renaissance artists. When you have the Reformation, after the Reformation is the Counter-Reformation. So during the Reformation, Martin Luther is preaching against the Catholic Church. The Counter-Reformation is the Catholic Church's attempt to get people back into the church. So the Catholic Counter-Reformation believed in religious imagery as powerful teaching tools, as it always had, but now it was used especially to dissuade followers from converting to Protestantism. The type of secular art, or art not commissioned by religious authorities, can be seen in Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Botticelli was a 3rd-generation Renaissance artist. He was a painter who worked for the Medici family. The Medicis were a wealthy merchant-class family in Florence who were also art patrons. They sponsored an academy, mainly a discussion group, where humanist scholars and artists met to discuss classical culture and its relationship to Christianity. So now the Birth of Venus, as we see here, Renaissance artists frequently used stories of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses as subject matter. The Renaissance, as we noted, was a renewal of classical antiquity. So that meant the science, philosophy, literature of the day, as well as the artistic styles. So oppositely from the Byzantine, where we saw a move away from that imagery to differentiate the Christian church from a paganistic Roman past, here we see the Catholic Church coming back to that imagery of these realistic and then idealized human figures. So here is the Birth of Venus. Venus is the Roman goddess of love and beauty. Her birth mythology starts with Saturn, who castrates his tyrant father Celes. Celes was the sky god. And Saturn throws Celes's genitals into the sea, and once it mixes with the seawater, Venus is born and ushered on a great clamshell to the shore. So there's the theme of destruction that turns or transforms into something beautiful. On the left, we have the god of wind, Zephyr and his wife, blowing Venus gently to shore. The personification of spring waits ready to clothe the Venus with a beautiful garment. And we see that in the Renaissance, you have this concern, like with people like Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael, who are concerned with this very linear space. They're using one-point perspective. But some artists were not concerned with depicting figures in realistic space, as seen with Botticelli. In this case, it was less about the realistic space and more about the beauty of depicting the body that goes back to those practices found in classical antiquity. The figure of Venus was actually modeled after a Roman sculpture of Venus that was owned by the Medici family. We see that, as was the case that we discussed in Greek art, it was not usual to represent a nude female. Nude men would have been very common, but nude females would have been much, much less common, at least until about the 4th century. So, in the Renaissance, a nude done to this scale had been largely absent since the classical past. Nudity is still relatively modest. We can see strategic hair and hand placements over her breast and genital area. Titian is another artist of the Renaissance who is still living, where new late Renaissance artists are trying to come into their own under the shadows of these great artists. So Titian was an artist that worked in Venice. So he's coming out of the traditions of Venice, where you have artists like Bellini, who had been trading with Northern Renaissance artists. So there is a large attention in Northern Italy on the use of oil paint. It's actually unknown who this is a specific portrait of. We do know that she's represented as Venus, and this makes her the perfect subject as an object of beauty. So to see a woman in this way in the Renaissance would have been incredibly inappropriate, but in this case, she is what is termed as being cloaked in allegory. So this means that rather than being represented as a specific individual in that contemporary age, that individual's face and her features are represented as the figure of Venus. So this makes it acceptable to represent her as a nude, as she, in essence, no longer is herself, but is embodying the idea of the goddess Venus. This painting has also a very sensual tone to it. Titian is using techniques in oil and layering. He was even said to have built up 15 layers of oil paint in this singular painting. So it gives us the real sense of this soft, kind of supple flesh. We can see as well there's a distortion with the body. If you take a look at her feet in comparison to the rest of her body, the feet are much too small. Her torso as well is elongated. And this particular painting that we see really initiates the emergence of the female nude as a prominent subject in Western art. So from this point on, we will see a lot more nude female representations, and we will also see how their representations change as far as the interaction with the viewer. So for instance, in this case, we can see this Titian's Venus is staring directly at the viewer, but she has her head kind of cocked to the side with this kind of come hither look. So it's meant to be very sensual, but we'll see that with artists in later centuries, this becomes different as women start to gain more independence as well as rights in society. So coming back to religious imagery, in the early phases of the late Renaissance. You have artists like Tintoretto. Tintoretto was the student of Titian in Venice. Tintoretto develops his style from the energetic brushwork and dramatic lights of Titian's later work. So in this instance, we see intensely dramatic quality of this painting is very characteristic of Counter-Reformation art. So again, creating art to prevent people from converting to Protestantism. So in the Italian Renaissance, the high Italian Renaissance, you have an emphasis on the internal, the intellectual, the subtle, this perfect harmony between man and nature. So when we look at this comparison, so you can see the bottom is the High Renaissance, and this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper in Milan. And the top is Tintoretto's Last Supper, the same subject matter, just represented by different artists in different artistic periods. So Tintoretto's image is above all externalized, theatrical, it's exaggerated, and emotional. So this would evolve to become the distinct characteristics of late Renaissance art, as well as Mannerism and Baroque art. You have in Tintoretto's a very strong diagonal line, which dramatically leads us to the focal point of Jesus, whereas in Leonardo da Vinci's representation, we immediately go to the figure of Christ as he is the central figure. There is an intense amount of asymmetrical balance in Tintoretto's image as well. So this contrasts with the kind of perfect harmony and symmetry of Leonardo's Last Supper. The extreme use of lights and darks is very important as well. You have extreme value contrast versus these very smooth transitions. So you can see in the shadows and the highlights of the figures in the Last Supper, it is a very smooth transition where you have distinctly opposing lights and darks in Tintoretto's representation. There is also an emphasis on depicting supernatural light, rather than light from the observation of the natural world. So in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, we see that the divinity of Christ is hinted by the natural light that is coming from the windows behind him. However, in Tintoretto's representation, we see a literal halo that is emanating from Christ's head, where the light beams reach up to the ceiling, across the table, and into those silhouettes of angels. We also have the presence of God being signified by the lamp above the table. So this emphasis on showing spiritual light starts to become more prominent in the late Renaissance era. So now we will move to Mannerism. So Mannerism comes after the late Renaissance and is a kind of evolution from those same styles of the late Renaissance. So you have, time-wise, the mid to the late 16th century. The term Mannerism comes from the Italian di manera, which means charm, grace, and playfulness. So the Mannerist style of painting is characterized by elongated human figures. There is a sense of grace, particularly in these kind of heart-wrenching subjects. You still see these beautiful figures. It is this idealization that is meant to evoke the sense of the spiritual realm, that this kind of grace and beauty, even in a horrific moment, is only exhibited through these kind of divine figures. So the Mannerist style really expresses a new kind of spirituality that's coming out of the Counter-Reformation, as opposed to the naturalism and intellect of the early Renaissance. This is also a period of revolution, especially in Florence. You also have people like Copernicus who are discovering that the Earth revolves around the sun. Mannerism is mainly applied to Italian art, but know that like there was also Northern Renaissance art, there's also Northern Mannerist art. We will not get to highlight these artists, but know that there are different styles based on those actions from the church and their opposers in multiple areas. So this is an altarpiece in a chapel painted by Jacopo da Pontormo. Pontormo's work is indicative of the early Mannerist style. We actually see the fresco to the right in this chapel were also completed by Pontormo. So the altarpiece would lay centrally, and the scene that we see here would be located to the right. And this depicts the Annunciation. The Annunciation is when Gabriel comes to the Virgin to deliver news that she will birth the Son of God. The two images create a relationship one another. It's kind of the beginning and end of Christ's earthly life, where Mary finds out she is pregnant to the moment that her son dies on the cross. So the beginning and end of the earthly life of Christ. There's also an emphasis on life and death as well as spiritual awakening. So let's take a little bit closer look at the actual altarpiece. There's some debate as to what is actually being depicted here, or which specific moment during Christ's crucifixion. It could be the deposition. The deposition is when Christ is being brought down from the cross, or it could be the entombment, when Christ is carried to the tomb after his crucifixion. Typically, in representations of either the deposition or the entombment, you would have certain symbols, such as the cross or the tomb, or even the ladder used to help lower Christ down. These symbols are not present in this image, so it's very ambiguous as to which point in time in the crucifixion we are at. We can tell that Christ is deceased. His face has a kind of greenish-gray appearance, hinting that he has no life left in him. There's also a lack of unearthly space, very different from the High Renaissance. All of the human subjects are pushed to the foreground. We see a little bit of the ground as well as the clouds in the sky, but very minimal as opposed to, say, representations in the High Renaissance. So this composition as well is incredibly dynamic. There's a lot more energy and activity rather than this kind of calmness and harmony. You have these unnatural bodily positions. Take a look at the body of Christ, for instance, where his torso is kind of jutting outward, and then his lower body, his hips, twist in the opposite direction. And take a look at the gentleman who is holding the bottom or the legs of Christ. He is hunched over and actually balancing on his tiptoes. Now this would be extremely difficult to carry a person in this way, particularly one who was unconscious or deceased. If we take a look at how the figures are arranged, they are in a circular configuration. So this leads the viewer's eye kind of coming back in circles. There's nowhere for the eye to actually rest. If we think to Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna of the Rocks or his Last Supper, you have in the Madonna of the Rocks a triangular composition, but the kind of main focal point is the head of the Virgin. The Last Supper, the main focal point is the head of Christ. So you're able to kind of sit and contemplate, whereas in Pontormo's, there is this sense of energy and activated viewing. Now we'll be moving to Rome. Giulio Romano was an avid collector of antiquities and artwork from some of the most renowned artists in Rome. He collected artworks from ancient Greece and Rome, but also from contemporary artists of his time, including many, many works by Raphael. In 1524, Giulio left Rome to work for the Gonzaga of Mantua. When he did this, he brought the artistic heritage from Raphael from Rome to a more provincial town. So now Raphael died in 1520. Giulio takes much of his collection elsewhere, so there was no clear successor to take up the artistic mantle. However, this did afford young and upcoming artists a chance to take up that legacy. One of these is Francesco Mazzola, more commonly known as Parmigianino, named after his hometown of Parma, Italy. He arrived in Rome the same year Giulio left, and Parmigianino immediately aimed to grab the attention of major patronage, such as Pope Clement VII. Patronage could be gathered from prominent families, foreign investors, but the greatest patronage was the clergy or the church, members of the church. Many of Parmigianino's contemporaries hailed him as being the second Raphael. However, Parmigianino was very slow and calculated with his process of planning, which resulted in him not receiving any large commissions, at least until later in his life. In this particular image, we see that Parmigianino was only 21 when he painted this. We're actually seeing a self-portrait in a convex mirror, or what has been made to look like a convex mirror. He actually used a curved wooden panel to reinforce the illusion that the surface is rounded. So there's a concept of painting in the Renaissance, as we discussed, that is a mirror of nature. So this concept of the mirror, or of a painting as being the mirror of nature, had become very commonplace. So here we're seeing that painting is actually transforming into something that nature could not produce by itself. So it becomes stranger, it becomes rarer, and more beautiful. This also exhibits the exquisite exaggerations that would become the trademark of the Mannerist style. In Parmigianino's Madonna of the Long Neck, we see him exemplifying the Mannerist style at its height. The proportions are exaggerated and elongated even further. There's this sense of grace and of beauty. Take a look again at the feet, the size of the feet compared to the legs, the torso, its length. The Christ child as well has a very larger than would be expected body, and is splayed with this torsion or twisting movement, especially with the left arm kind of falling limply down at the side. And we're still seeing influence from earlier works come in. For example, Parmigianino took direct influence from Michelangelo's Pietà. So in Parmigianino's representation, Christ is a child, he's a baby, but his position possibly echoes the moment later on in Christ's life when Mary will hold him in a similar way after his crucifixion. So here the baby is asleep, but almost appears as if it's dead. And although the distortion is more obvious and pronounced in Parmigianino's, Michelangelo's sculpture is likewise distorted, but it is hidden. So in the High Renaissance, you have distortion being used to perfect the figure, while distortion in the Late Renaissance and Mannerism is used to beautify the figure. So we see some of these trends occurring. Take a look, for example, of this detail of the Virgin Mary. If you take a look at her hand, it appears boneless in the fingertips. They are impossibly long. The idea here is that rather than art being a product taken from nature Now, artists are looking at previous artwork. So art is taken from art instead of art taken from nature. Now, surrounding the Virgin are angels, but it's difficult to tell if they actually are angels. However, in this figure that holds this metallic-looking vase, we can see a wing that comes behind and comes over the drapery. So it's very subtle, again, very subtle hints at this religious symbolism. We can see the elongated features as well in these angelic figures. It is not just in the Virgin and Child. These figures as well are idealized. We can see the face of this girl. She has a very symmetrical face. Her nose is elongated. Her face is made into an oval shape. Another interesting aspect of this painting is the design as well as the fact that it's unfinished. Parmigianino unfortunately died before he could finish this painting, and this is about as far as he got. So the design of the painting is actually based on a text from medieval times. This text contained hymns to the Virgin Mary. In one of these hymns, it likens her neck to a great ivory column, which supports the Church of God. So here we see not just one, but many ivory columns that are holding up this house or Church of God. As well, an interesting part is the figure of Saint Jerome in the bottom right corner. He is a prophet and saint associated with adoration for the Virgin. Now I want you to take a look at the figure of Jerome. What's unusual about his representation is that, for one, you can actually see through his garment to the stairs. The scroll as well reveals the side of the pillar or the column. So the figure has not had all of its layers of oil completed just yet. In addition to that, we can see a third foot, which gives us the hint that Parmigianino was trying to work through his positioning on this canvas. So it's just kind of an interesting insight into what the artist was thinking and how they were thinking about placing things on the canvas. All right, so this is the end of our presentation for today's lecture. So for April 18th's lecture, we will be discussing the Baroque and Rococo periods. So review your PowerPoint presentation on Northern Renaissance, Late Renaissance, and Mannerism. Remember that your museum essay is due on Blackboard on April 20th by 11:59 p.m. You do not need to hand in a hard copy. As well, no late submissions will be accepted. So please give yourself time to get that submitted. For the journal, remember to compose at least one single page of notes on each lecture. You should have 6 pages minimum for your journal. So journals included 6 pages of notes and 2 discussion questions. This will be due in hard copy only at the beginning of class on Monday, April 30th. I hope you all have a great day. I'll see you next time.